Humans have always been fascinated by space. As we look up at the night sky blanketing us, it is impossible not to be filled with awe at its majesty. For the longest time, space was the exclusive realm of the gods. One can imagine the wonder of early civilizations as they glanced up at the night sky, unencumbered by modern light pollution, to witness the galaxies of stars perched above them. It's not surprising that the earliest of civilizations saw the divine reflected in each shimmering star, or that they believed that the heavens were the divine creation of an omnipotent deity. To these early human civilizations, the idea that humans would one day explore and maybe even regulate the cosmos must have seemed almost fantastical. What role could humans possibly play in controlling the house of God? A couple of millennia later, however, the need to regulate the realm of the angels would be apparent. Humanity now populates the heavens in ways that would have scarcely seemed possible to these early civilizations. And with our success has come a need to provide rules to govern the orderly exploration of space, and humankind's use of the abundant resources that populate the celestial bodies. This need led to an explosion of space laws and regulations in the 1960s and 1970s. In this week's podcast, we will outline the various international treaties, rules and regulations, and regimes that govern human conduct in the exploration and exploitation of space. We will examine their general principles, specific proclamations, as well as assess their level of participation. I'm your professor, Glenn Torres-Spelliscy, and thanks for joining me this week. Space law was birthed as a result of the competitive pressures of the Cold War between the first two spacefaring nations, the United States and the Soviet Union. The conflict between the two superpowers spanned multiple areas, and as the two countries raced into space, it is perhaps no surprise that the conflict spread there as well. By the end of the 1950s, both the Soviet Union and the United States had successfully launched satellites into Earth's orbit. Both countries, as a result, felt the need to come up with regulations for how this new area would be regulated. And why was this important? The short and easy answer is national security. The international community, and specifically the two superpowers, saw that there was great strategic risk with respect to how space was used, and that warranted negotiating principles to reduce tensions. Primary among the concerns was that the terrestrial arms race that had erupted early in the years of the Cold War would bleed into space, and that was something that both the Soviets and the Americans wanted to avoid. In 1958, shortly after the US had launched its first satellite, equaling the Soviet Sputnik achievement in the prior year, the first set of soft law principles was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly. Resolution 1348 recognized the common interest of mankind in outer space, and that it is the common aim that outer space should be used for peaceful purposes only. This was the first international expression of the principle of peaceful purposes, which would come to dominate space law in the coming decades and still remains a guiding principle today. The resolution also established the most important legal body with respect to international space law, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or COPUOS, which is still the preeminent international law body regulating space activities today. The committee was specifically established to, among other things, report on the nature of legal problems that might arise in the carrying out of programs to explore outer space. Over the next decade, the General Assembly would adopt numerous resolutions, declaring that space must be used for peaceful purposes, and that it was to be used for the benefit of all parties. Importantly, the resolutions noted that it was not to be appropriated by any party, but to be used for the benefit of every nation. This culminated in the 1963 Declaration of Legal Principles, governing activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space. The Declaration sets out a series of principles with respect to space that still provide the foundational basis for many of the treaties that control space activities today. Space is to be used for the benefit of all. It cannot be appropriated by any particular nation. States are liable for any damages resulting from launches from their territory, whether by the government or non-government entities. States have a duty to rescue astronauts in danger. States have duties to ensure that launches from their territory adhere to principles of international law. All these principles would form the basis of the 5 primary international law treaties that are now at the foundation of international space law. Why were the treaties necessary? Well, if you think back to our discussion on the sources of international law last week, General Assembly resolutions, though influential, are not binding statements on international law. As a result, the international community saw value in codifying these principles into binding international law. So let's take a moment here to dive into the 5 core treaties that form the basis of space law. The first of these international treaties was the Outer Space Treaty, adopted in 1967. Over the next decade, the international community would adopt the Rescue and Return Agreement in 1968, the Liability Convention in 1972, the Registration Convention in 1975, and finally the Moon Agreement in 1979. The Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, known as the Outer Space Treaty, was adopted in 1967, after negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union resulted in a compromise text. For the first time, the existing spacefaring nations had decided on a set of legally binding principles related to the regulating of their conduct in outer space. The OST reflected many of the principles that had been declared in the previous soft law resolutions, including the non-appropriation of space, its use for peaceful purposes, that space exploration should be carried out for the good of all mankind, etc. The treaty also codified ideas about liability, assistance in times of emergency, and that the UN would serve as the registering authority designed to track launches. The Outer Space Treaty has a very high level of participation, and it is the starting point for any discussion of space law. We will certainly spend a lot of time each week talking about what its provisions require of states operating in space. Now, the following decade was met with a flurry of activity as the United Nations sought to build a comprehensive regulatory system for space. The next treaty, the Rescue Agreement, entered into force in December of 1968, and it would further describe the duties of rescue and return. 4 years later, the Liability Convention would be adopted, establishing a system of absolute liability for injuries on Earth caused by space objects, and negligent liability for injuries to other space objects. Another 4 years later, the Registration Convention would be adopted, requiring states to register launches with the UN. This meant that there would be transparency with respect to the ownership of space objects. Now, this was important in support of the Liability Treaty and the Return Treaty, because if you didn't know who an object belonged to, how could you hold someone liable, or how could you return it? It was unfortunately at this point that levels of cooperation between the powers would begin to wane. While the United States and Soviet Union had spearheaded many of the negotiations to the prior treaties, there was much less enthusiasm with respect to the final treaty to be negotiated, and that's the agreement governing activities of states on the Moon and other celestial bodies. This agreement tried to set out some new principles with respect to appropriation and how resources would be distributed among nations. The treaty identified space resources as the common heritage of mankind. And space powers like the United States and Soviets balked at the inclusion of that language, the language that called for the resources of celestial bodies to be treated as common property, as the common heritage of humankind. Even the United States, who had originally supported that treaty language, would soon advocate for possessive rights to the resources removed from celestial bodies. As a result, only 18 states are parties to the Moon Treaty, and none of these states have an advanced space program. So it really was a question of how to divide the spoils of space exploration that would bring an end to an era of almost unprecedented cooperation and coordination in space. For a decade, the international community had churned out treaty after treaty seeking to establish a set of ground rules that would ensure the peaceful exploration of space. After the failure of the 1979 Moon Agreement to gather significant support, that process would stop. Now, as for customary law, some scholars argue that the 1963 Declaration has achieved a customary status, but there simply has not been a lot of state practice or enough time to develop significant customary rules. However, given the lack of treaty progress over the last 40 years, customary law may grow in importance in the decades to come. In the absence of international treaties, soft law has begun to take on a more significant role in the formation of space law. These standards, while not holding the same legal power as a binding treaty, are still a way that the regulatory structure can be built. Indeed, if you think back to the chapter on constructing smart and effective regulations, one of the key points was to use voluntary compliance mechanisms and standards until the imposition of more controlling mechanisms became necessary. Such standards are prominent with respect to the regulatory regime in space. The lecture book looks through many of these resolutions and standards in detail. Well, that does it for this week's short podcast. The main point I want you to take away this week is that the regulatory system that currently controls space activity is antiquated. It's out of date. It's not in line with present needs because it was built for a world that no longer exists. Well, I'll see you next week for another episode of the Space Law and Policy podcast series.